The galaxy was old. It had seen empires rise and fall like waves on a shore. The 12 elder species had ruled for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to be surprised. They controlled the best planets, the richest trade routes, and the most powerful weapons. They sat together in the Galactic Council and decided the fate of billions. They believed they knew everything worth knowing. They were wrong about humans. The first human colony ships arrived in the outer spiral arm about 2,000 years ago. They were ugly things, those ships. Patched together from old parts, held together by hope and welding torches. They moved slowly through the dark spaces between stars, carrying families who had left Earth looking for something better. The Council noticed them, of course. A minor official named Telvos, a tall insect-like creature from the Caranti species, wrote the first report. He studied the humans for 3 days. He watched their ships limp into orbit around a frozen moon that nobody wanted. He observed them set up their little habitats and begin drilling into the ice. His report was short. Bipedal mammals. Short-lived, rarely reaching 100 years. Technologically primitive compared to Council standards. No unified government that he could identify. Multiple languages, multiple cultures, multiple competing factions, even within single ships. He recommended classification as a Tier 7 species, which meant non-threat, not worth watching. The report was filed and forgotten. Telvos moved on to other duties. The frozen moon was called Europa Minor by the humans who settled there. Nobody else cared what it was called. That was the beginning, thought the thing about humans that the Council failed to understand was simple. Humans did not need the best planets. They did not need rich trade routes or powerful weapons. They just needed a chance. Give them a crack in the wall, and they would make a home there. Europa Minor was a ball of ice circling a gas giant in a system that the Sorrel Collective had surveyed and abandoned 3 centuries earlier. The survey team had noted the presence of water ice and some trace minerals, but the extraction costs exceeded the value. Not worth the effort. Move on. The humans who landed there did not care about extraction costs. They cared about survival. Within 10 years, they had built a city under the ice. They melted water for drinking and farming. They used the cold itself as a tool, preserving food and medicine in the endless freeze. They found minerals the Sorrel survey had missed, or perhaps had not bothered to look for. They made do. Other ships followed. Not in a great wave, but in a slow trickle. A ship here, a ship there. They landed on worlds that nobody wanted. Toxic planets where the air burned the lungs. Barren rocks with no atmosphere at all. Moons too small to appear on most star maps. The garbage dumps of the galaxy, the places that civilized species had examined and rejected. Humans took them all, on a world called Cinder, where the ground was hot enough to melt metal in the daytime. Humans built underground. They came up at night when the temperature dropped, and they mined the rich veins of ore that ran through the planet's crust. They adapted their bodies over generations, becoming tolerant of heat that would kill their ancestors. On a gas giant's moon called Whisper, where the atmosphere was a toxic soup of methane and ammonia, humans built sealed domes. They engineered plants that could filter the poison, and slowly, over centuries, they began to change the air itself. Their great-grandchildren would breathe that air without masks, on asteroid belts that stretched between dead stars. Humans built stations and hollowed out rocks and made them into homes. They became miners and traders and engineers. They learned to live in zero gravity, to birth children in the void, to die and be buried in the endless dark between worlds. 100 years passed. The Council held its regular meetings. They discussed trade disputes and border conflicts and the proper classification of newly discovered species. Occasionally, a report would mention human activity in some distant system. These reports were filed with the others. Nobody read them twice. 200 years passed. Human colonies now numbered in the dozens. They had spread across a region of space larger than some council member territories. But they were scattered, unconnected, seemingly random. There was no human empire, no human fleet, no human voice demanding recognition. They were just there, like moss growing in the cracks of an old building. The Caranthi official who had replaced Telvos 3 generations later updated the species file. Humans now occupied approximately 47 known worlds, he noted. Population estimates were difficult because humans did not conduct centralized censuses. They still had no unified government. Their technology had improved somewhat but remained below council standards. Classification remained Tier 7. He added a note at the bottom, almost as an afterthought. Humans displayed unusual adaptability to hostile environments. Recommend continued low priority monitoring. The note was ignored like all the others. By the time 300 years had passed since the first human ship arrived, they had spread to over 400 worlds. They had developed their own style of faster-than-light travel, different from council designs but functional. They had built trading networks that connected their scattered colonies. They had created universities and hospitals and factories, all without asking permission from anyone. And still, almost nobody noticed. The galaxy was vast, and the council's attention was fixed on matters they considered important. Border disputes between the great powers, trade negotiations worth trillions of credits, the rise and fall of political factions within the elder species. These were the things that filled the news feeds and occupied the minds of those who believed they ruled the stars. Humans were not important. They lived on garbage worlds. They had short lives and primitive technology. They could not even agree among themselves on basic matters of governance. They were beneath notice. This was the greatest gift the galaxy ever gave to humanity. They were free to grow in the shadows, to make their mistakes in private, to learn and adapt and spread without interference. They were ignored, and in being ignored, they became strong. In the council chambers on Hearthworld, the capital of galactic civilization, the 12 elder species debated matters of great importance. None of them looked toward the outer spiral arm, where 400 human worlds hummed with quiet activity. None of them understood what was growing there. Not yet. Ambassador Yineth of the Sorrel Collective had served in her position for 60 years. She was considered one of the finest economic minds in the galaxy. Her scales had turned silver with age, and her 4 eyes had grown wise from watching the flow of trade across 1,000 systems. She had seen market crashes and trade wars and the rise and fall of merchant houses that had existed for millennia. She had never seen anything like this. The numbers on her screen made no sense. Prices were falling in sectors where they should have been stable. Rare minerals that had commanded fortunes for centuries were suddenly flooding the market at a fraction of their former cost. Supply chains that had been reliable since before her grandmother's birth were quietly rerouting through systems that barely appeared on official maps. She called in her best analysts. They worked for 3 weeks, tracing the disruptions through layer after layer of transactions. When they finally presented their findings, Yineth did not believe them at first. Humans. The disruption was coming from humans, not organized humans. Not a human corporation or a human government. Just humans. Thousands of them, operating independently, scattered across the galaxy like seeds blown by the wind. Human cargo haulers moving through spaces between patrol routes. Human mining operations extracting resources from asteroids, too small to be worth the attention of major companies. Human engineers repairing ships at half the standard rate. Human traders buying low in one system and selling high in another, finding price differences that official markets had somehow missed. None of them were breaking laws. None of them were doing anything that could be officially complained about. They were simply filling every gap in the galactic economy, every crack that the established powers had left open. Yenith requested a meeting with a human representative. This was harder than she expected. Humans had no embassy, no official diplomatic corps, no Ministry of Trade. After 2 months of searching, her staff found a human woman who ran a shipping company and was willing to talk. Her name was Priya Singh. She arrived at the meeting in work clothes, grease stains still visible on her sleeves. Her ship, she explained, was being repaired in the station's lower docks. She had an hour before she needed to get back. Yenith studied the human carefully. Priya was small by galactic standards, with dark skin and dark hair and eyes that seemed to find everything slightly amusing. She sat in the chair designed for species twice her size and did not seem uncomfortable. "Your people are disrupting centuries of trade agreements," Yenith began. Priya raised her eyebrows. "Are we? Mineral prices have fallen by 30% in the Outer Rim territories. Shipping costs have dropped even further. 3 major trading houses have filed complaints with the council." "Okay," Priya said slowly. "But what did we do wrong?" This was the problem. Yenith had reviewed the laws carefully. Humans had violated none of them. They were simply competing in spaces where competition had not existed before. They were offering services at prices that established companies could not match. They were finding opportunities that others had overlooked. "You are destabilizing the market," Yenith said. Priya shrugged. "We're just going where there's work. We see a job that needs doing, we do it. We see cargo that needs moving, we move it. Is that not allowed? How are you coordinating? Who is directing your activities?" "Nobody." Priya seemed genuinely confused by the question. "I run my ship. Raj down on Kepler's world runs his mining operation. May over in the consortium space runs her repair shop. We talk sometimes. Share information about good opportunities. Help each other out when we can. But nobody's in charge." "That's impossible. Someone must be organizing this." Priya laughed. It was a warm sound, without mockery. "Ambassador, I don't even know most of the humans in this sector. We just all need to make a living. We find ways to do that. Sometimes those ways happen to be similar." The conversation went on for another hour. Yenith asked questions about human trade practices, human economic philosophy, human organizational structures. Priya answered as best she could, but her answers only deepened the mystery. Humans did not seem to have economic philosophy. They just had economics, the same way they just had breathing and eating. After Priya left to return to her ship, Yenith sat alone in her office for a long time. She understood competition. She understood trade wars and market manipulation and the careful dance of corporations seeking advantage. But this was something different. This was not a strategy. This was not a plan. This was just humans being humans, scattered across the galaxy, each one pursuing their own small goals. And somehow the combined effect was reshaping everything. It was like watching water wear away stone. No single drop was significant. But together, over time, they carved canyons. Yenith wrote a report to the council. She recommended closer observation of human economic activities. She suggested that perhaps the Tier 7 classification should be reviewed. She warned that the long-term implications of human trade practices were difficult to predict but potentially significant. The council received her report. It was discussed briefly in a subcommittee meeting. The Caranthi representative pointed out that humans still had no unified government and posed no military threat. The Vorn delegate noted that human technology remained inferior to council standards. The matter was tabled for future discussion. Yenith retired from her position 5 years later. By then, human traders had spread to 3 more sectors. Prices continued to shift. Supply chains continued to adapt. The established powers continued to file complaints that went nowhere. Her successor, a young sorrel named Torith, read her old reports with growing unease. He saw what she had seen, but decades later, the pattern was even clearer. Humans were not trying to dominate the galactic economy. They were becoming the galactic economy, one small transaction at a time. He filed his own reports. They were ignored just like hers. The Council had more important things to worry about. Wars to prevent. Treaties to negotiate. The endless dance of power among the 12 elder species. Meanwhile, human ships moved through the spaces between stars, carrying cargo and passengers and something else that nobody had noticed yet. They were carrying connections, relationships, networks of trust and mutual aid that crossed every boundary the galaxy had ever drawn. The invisible economy grew stronger every year, and still, almost nobody was watching. The invitation took 3 years to deliver. Not because faster-than-light communication was slow, but because the Galactic Council could not find anyone to send it to. Humans had no head of state. They had no foreign ministry. They had no official body that could accept an invitation on behalf of their species. Council diplomats traveled to human worlds and asked who was in charge. They received different answers everywhere they went. On one world, they were directed to a town council. On another, to a cooperative of mining companies. On a third, to a religious leader who politely explained that she only spoke for her own congregation. Eventually, through a process that no one fully understood, a man named Marcus Chen was selected to receive the invitation. He was 87 years old, a retired engineer who had spent most of his life building water reclamation systems on desert worlds. He had no political experience. He had never wanted political experience. When the council's messenger arrived at his home on a dusty moon called Patience, Marcus was in his garden, trying to convince a stubborn tomato plant to produce fruit in low gravity. "You want me to do what?" he asked. The messenger, a young sorrel diplomat named Varys, explained again. The Galactic Council wished to formally invite humanity to join as a member species. This was the highest honor the Council could offer. It would give humans a voice in galactic governance, access to Council resources, and recognition as equals among the elder species. Marcus wiped dirt from his hands and considered this. "I'm not sure I'm the right person," he said. "I'm just an engineer." "You were selected by your people," Varys said. "Selected how?" Varys was not entirely sure. There had been discussions across human networks. Names had been proposed and rejected. Somehow, through a process that involved thousands of conversations on hundreds of worlds, Marcus Chen had emerged as someone that most humans trusted to speak for them. Not because he was powerful or important, but because he was not. Marcus traveled to Hearthworld aboard a ship called the Open Hand. It was a diplomatic vessel that the Council had provided, but human engineers had modified it during the journey, improving the engines and repairing systems that Council maintenance crews had neglected. When they arrived, the ship ran better than it had in decades. High Arbiter Selmuth received Marcus in the Great Chamber where the Council had met for 10,000 years. 12 species were represented, each with their ancient seats and their ancient rituals. Marcus wore clean work clothes and carried a tablet with notes that various human communities had sent him. "We are honored by your invitation," Marcus began, reading carefully. "The people I represent appreciate the Council's recognition of our species." "Then you accept?" Selmuth asked. Marcus hesitated. "That's the problem. I'm not sure we can." The chamber stirred. This was not the expected response. "You have 4,000 worlds," Selmuth said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Trillions of citizens. Industrial capacity rivaling the Sorrel Collective. How can you not accept membership?" "Because we don't really have a government," Marcus explained. I can't sign a treaty that binds all humans. Nobody can. We have agreements between colonies, sure. Networks that cooperate on trade and defense. Communities that help each other out. But there's no central authority. Nobody's in charge. That is impossible, is it? Marcus smiled, the way someone smiles when they've heard a joke many times before. We tried centralized government a few times. It never worked out. Humans don't like being told what to do by people far away who don't understand their problems. So we stopped trying. The negotiations that followed were the strangest in Council history. Every framework that the Council proposed assumed hierarchy. Treaties between authorities. Binding commitments enforced from above. Representatives who could speak for their entire species. Humans had none of these things and did not seem to want them. Marcus consulted constantly with human communities across the galaxy. Messages flew back and forth, carrying questions and suggestions and concerns. Sometimes he would pause a negotiation to wait for responses that took days to arrive. The Council. Representatives grew frustrated, but there was nothing they could do. How do you make decisions? Councillor Torath asked during one session. We talk, Marcus said. We share information. We argue. Eventually, something like consensus emerges. Not always, but often enough. What if someone disagrees? Then they do what they think is right, and we deal with the consequences. Sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes we're wrong. We figure it out as we go. That sounds chaotic. It is, but it works. We're still here, aren't we? The final agreement took 5 years to negotiate. It was called the Framework of Mutual Recognition, and it was unlike anything the Council had ever produced. Humans would participate in Council deliberations, but not through a single representative. They would send rotating delegates from different worlds, chosen by methods that varied from colony to colony. They could vote on matters that affected human interests, but those votes were advisory, reflecting the general sentiment of human communities rather than binding decisions. Agreements made under the framework would be honored by humans, not because a central authority enforced them, but because human communities chose to honor them. If a community disagreed with an agreement, they could opt out, and the Council would have to accept this. It was messy. It was inefficient. It made the Council's lawyers uncomfortable, but it worked out in the decades that followed. Humans became essential to galactic civilization, not as rulers or conquerors, but as connectors. Human traders linked markets that had never communicated. Human engineers solved problems that elder species had given up on. Human diplomats, unofficial and often unauthorized, mediated disputes between powers that had been enemies for millennia, and humans continued to help the forgotten ones. The abandoned species, the discarded peoples, the refugees from 1,000 different tragedies. They found homes in human space. They became part of human networks. They grew and thrived, and eventually reached out to help others themselves. High Arbiter Selmuth died shortly after the framework was ratified. In his final journal entry, he wrote his assessment of humanity. We spent 2 millennia ignoring them, and they spent 2 millennia growing. We built empires. They built connections. We conquered. They adapted. We looked for threats and saw none. We should have been looking for something else entirely. They were never trying to compete with us. They were never trying to replace us. They were becoming something we couldn't recognize until it was too late to do anything but accept them as equals. He paused, then added one final line. Perhaps they were never the ones who needed to change. Humanity had drifted into the galaxy, quiet and unnoticed, settling in the cracks and corners that nobody else wanted. They had grown in the shadows, making mistakes and learning from them, building networks and relationships that crossed every boundary. And now, 2,000 years after the first colony ship had limped into orbit around a frozen moon, They had become the backbone of a civilization that had once dismissed them as primitives, not because they were stronger than the elder species, not because they were smarter or more advanced, but because they had understood something that empires never did. The galaxy was too vast for any one power to control. The future belonged not to those who conquered, but to those who connected. And no one in the history of the stars had ever been better at making connections than humanity. This was the truth that the Council finally understood. This was why humans had won without ever fighting a war. And this was only the beginning. The war between the hegemony of Kreth and the Vorn Empire had been brewing for a century. Both sides claimed the same stretch of resource-rich space along their shared border. Both sides had spent decades building fleets and training soldiers. When the first shots were finally fired, military experts across the galaxy predicted a swift campaign. The Kreth had superior numbers. The Vorn had superior technology. One side or the other would win within a year. Neither side had thought about the humans. There were 17 human colonies scattered through the disputed territory. Small settlements on worlds that both empires had surveyed and dismissed long ago. Farming communities, mining operations, a few trading posts. Nothing that appeared in strategic planning documents. Nothing that wanted attention. General Vrex of the Kreth hegemony commanded the Third Fleet. His orders were simple: secure the border systems and establish forward bases for the main offensive. His first target was a minor agricultural world that human settlers called New Manitoba. According to his intelligence reports, the population was approximately 50,000. They had no military. They had no defenses worth mentioning. They would surrender immediately upon seeing his warships. The Third Fleet arrived in orbit around New Manitoba on a bright spring morning, local time. General Vrex broadcast a standard ultimatum: surrender within 1 hour or face orbital bombardment. The response came from a woman who identified herself as Mayor Chun. She sounded tired, like someone who had been woken from sleep. She asked if there was some kind of mistake. When informed that there was no mistake, she said she would need to consult with her community. 2 hours passed. General Vrex grew impatient. He ordered a warning shot, a small kinetic bombardment of an empty field outside the main settlement. The field was not empty. It contained sensor equipment that the humans had been using to track asteroid movements in the system. When the bombardment destroyed it, the humans apparently decided that talking was over. General Vrex never saw what killed his flagship. The Kreth vessel Dominions. Pride was the largest warship in the Third Fleet. It carried 3,000 crew and enough firepower to level a continent. It died in a flash of light and debris when a medium-sized comet struck it at a significant fraction of light speed. The comet had been in a stable orbit around the system's outer gas giant for millions of years. Somehow, in the 2 hours since the fleet's arrival, it had been redirected. Later analysis would reveal that humans had maintained asteroid deflection systems throughout the outer system, originally installed to protect their colony from natural impacts. They had simply pointed those systems at a new target. The Third Fleet scattered. Vrex, who had managed to reach an escape pod, was rescued by one of his surviving cruisers. He immediately demanded an explanation from his intelligence officers. They could not provide one. The humans on New Manitoba had no military. This was confirmed. They had farmers and miners and engineers and teachers. They had children and elderly and ordinary people living ordinary lives. But they also had equipment designed to move rocks through space, and they had used that equipment to move a very large rock very quickly. Vrex called for reinforcements. 6 more cruisers arrived from hegemony core worlds. He ordered a ground invasion, reasoning that the humans could not drop comets on their own planet. The landing went badly from the start. human resistance was not organized in any way that Kreth tacticians understood. There were no military formations, no command centers to destroy, no leaders to capture. Instead, there were thousands of small problems. Navigation beacons that gave false readings. Fuel supplies that had been contaminated with compounds that clogged engine intakes. Bridges that collapsed at inconvenient moments. Snipers who fired once and vanished into terrain. They knew better than any invader could. The humans of New Manitoba had been farming difficult land for generations. They knew every hill, every stream, every cave. They had built their homes to withstand earthquakes and superstorms and the occasional asteroid near miss. They were not soldiers, but they were survivors, and they did not intend to stop surviving now. After 3 months, Kreth forces controlled exactly 4 square kilometers of New Manitoba's surface. Casualties numbered in the thousands. Supply lines were constantly disrupted. Morale was collapsing. Vrex received new orders. Withdraw and proceed to the next objective. New Manitoba was not worth the cost. The Vorn Empire fared no better. Their strategy focused on a different sector, where 5 human colonies provided labor for independent mining operations. The Vorn commander, Admiral Silaith, was smarter than Vrex. She did not attempt direct conquest. Instead, she established a blockade. Intending to starve the human colonies into submission, the blockade failed within 6 weeks. Human ships slipped through gaps in the Vorn formation that should not have existed. They used routes through asteroid fields that were supposed to be unnavigable. They appeared and disappeared like ghosts, always carrying just enough supplies to keep the colonies functioning. Celeste tightened the blockade. She brought in more ships, more sensors, more patrols. The humans adapted. They started using communication systems that the Vorn could not intercept. They coordinated without any central command that Silaith could disrupt. They helped each other in ways that seemed spontaneous but were devastatingly effective. Meanwhile, strange things began happening to Vorn ships. Engine failures, computer glitches, food supplies that spoiled unexpectedly. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be traced to a clear source. Just an endless series of small problems that ground away at the fleet's effectiveness. Silaith suspected sabotage but could prove nothing. Her crews were Vorn, loyal to the Empire. But her ships had been serviced at stations throughout the region, many of them employing human workers. Replacement parts had come from suppliers who might have been human or might have traded with humans. The supply chain was impossibly tangled, and humans were everywhere in it. After 6 months, the Vorn blockade was consuming more resources than it was worth. Silaith recommended withdrawal. High Command agreed. The Kreth-Vorn War continued for another 2 years, but it no longer touched human space. Both sides quietly redirected their forces to other fronts. Official reports called this a strategic reallocation. Unofficially, word spread through both militaries. Do not fight the humans. It is not worth the cost. The Galactic Council received intelligence briefings about these events. Some members expressed concern. The humans had demonstrated unexpected military capability. Perhaps the Tier 7 classification should be reviewed. High Arbiter Selmuth considered the matter carefully. The humans had defended themselves effectively, yes. But they had not attacked anyone. They had not seized territory or demanded concessions. They had simply refused to be conquered and then gone back to their farms and mines and trading posts. They are not a threat, Selmuth concluded. They are simply persistent. We will continue to monitor them. The classification remained unchanged on New Manitoba. Mayor Chun returned to her normal duties. The fields that had been damaged by Kreth bombardment were replanted. The dead were mourned and buried. Life went on. When asked later how a colony of farmers had defeated the Third Fleet of the Kreth hegemony, Chun smiled and shrugged. "We've been moving rocks around this system for 200 years, she said. "We just moved a bigger one." It was not the answer anyone wanted to hear, but it was the truth. Humans did not win wars through superior firepower or grand strategy. They won by being impossible to remove, like weeds in a garden, like water seeping through cracks in stone. The galaxy was slowly beginning to learn this lesson, but the biggest lessons were still to come. Every 500 years, the Galactic Council conducted a census. It was a massive undertaking, requiring thousands of surveyors and analysts working for decades to count every sentient being in known space. The results were always predictable. The 12 elder species dominated. Dozens of minor client races filled supporting roles. The numbers shifted slightly from one census to the next, but the basic order of the galaxy remained unchanged. The census that began in the year 4847 by council reckoning was expected to be no different. High Arbiter Selmuth received the preliminary results on a quiet morning in his chambers on Hearthworld. He was old now, his gray skin wrinkled and his movements slow. He had served as High Arbiter for 2 centuries and had seen many reports cross his desk. None had ever made him feel the way this one did. The numbers were wrong. They had to be wrong. He called for verification. Independent teams were sent to confirm the data. They came back with the same results. If anything, the original estimates had been conservative. Humans now occupied over 4,000 worlds. Selmuth, read the number 3 times. 4,000 worlds. When he had taken office, humans had been on perhaps 500. He had not paid much attention to them since then. They were a Tier 7 species, primitive and disorganized. Not worth the attention of the High Arbiter. But that was not the worst of it. Human population now exceeded that of 8 of the 12 elder species. Only the Caranthi, the Sorrel, the Vorn, and the Kreth had larger numbers. And human population was growing faster than any of them. Their combined industrial output, measured as best as the surveyors could estimate, rivaled the Sorrel collective. The Sorrel had been the economic powerhouse of the galaxy for millennia. Humans had matched them in 20 centuries, starting from nothing, on worlds that nobody else had wanted. Selmuth demanded more information. Survey teams were dispatched to human territories with orders to observe and report. What they found disturbed him even more than the numbers. Human worlds were not the primitive backwaters he'd imagined. They were thriving. Human cities rose from frozen wastes and toxic deserts and barren rocks. Human factories produced goods that matched or exceeded council standards. Human universities taught sciences and arts and philosophies that had developed independently of any galactic tradition. Human medicine had advanced beyond what many elder species possessed. Human engineers had solved problems that council scientists had declared unsolvable. Human artists created works that moved observers from a dozen different species to tears, and humans had begun helping others. This was the detail that troubled Selmuth most. Throughout the galaxy, there were minor species that had been abandoned by their patrons. Races that had been uplifted and then discarded when they were no longer useful. Species that lived in poverty and despair on the margins of civilized space. Forgotten by everyone who might have helped them. Humans had found them. On a moon in the Caranthi outer reaches, a species called the Melith had been slowly dying for centuries. Their patrons had abandoned them when their homeworld's resources ran out. They had no technology, no hope, no future. Human traders had started visiting the Melith 300 years ago. At first, they just bought the simple crafts that the Melith made to survive. Then they started teaching medicine, engineering, agriculture. They helped the Melith rebuild their society, not as servants or clients, but as partners. The Melith now ran their own trading company. They had representatives on 5 human worlds. Their children attended human universities. They were not human subjects or human property. They were human friends. The same story repeated across dozens of species. The Keth, abandoned by the Vorn Empire. The Hollow People, cast out by the Sorrow Collective. The Singers of Dust, whose patrons had vanished into history so long ago that no one remembered their names. All of them had found homes among humans. All of them were thriving. Counselor Torath, grandson of the Unith who had first noticed human economic activity, presented these findings to the full council. He spoke for 3 hours, showing images and data and testimonies from across human space. When he finished, the chamber was silent. "What do they want?" asked the Kreth representative finally. Torath did not have an answer. That was the strangest part. Humans had not asked for anything. They had not demanded recognition, or territory, or trade concessions. They had not threatened anyone or issued ultimatums. They had simply grown, quietly, in the spaces that nobody else wanted. "They're building something," Torath said slowly. "I don't know what to call it. It's not an empire. They have no emperor, no central authority, no unified military. It's not a federation. They have no treaty binding their worlds together. It's something else. Something we don't have a word for." The Vorn representative spoke up. "A network," he suggested. "A web of connections without a center." "Perhaps," Torath agreed. "But it's more than that. They're not just connecting themselves. They're connecting everyone they touch. Every species they trade with, every people they help, becomes part of their network. Not as subjects, as members." High Arbiter Selmuth finally spoke. His voice was quiet, the voice of an old man confronting something he should have seen long ago. "We ignored them," he said. "For 2,000 years, we ignored them. We thought they were primitive. We thought they were disorganized. We thought they were beneath our notice." He looked around the chamber at the representatives of species that had ruled the galaxy since before humans had discovered fire. "We were wrong," he said. "And now we must decide what to do about it." The debate that followed lasted for decades. Some called for immediate action against the human threat. Others argued that humans pose no threat at all. Some proposed trade agreements, others military alliances, still others careful observation and nothing more. But even as the council debated, humans continued to grow. Their population increased. Their worlds multiplied. Their networks spread deeper into galactic society, by the time the council finally agreed on a course of action. It was already too late to do anything but accept what humanity had become. The galaxy had ignored the humans for 2,000 years. Now it would have to learn to live with them.